Whether or not it will be a fight to the finish in the Middle East hangs in the balance, but there was certainly no let-up in Israel's bombardment of what it says are Hezbollah targets inside Lebanon, deep inside in some cases. It said it had killed the head of Hezbollah's missile division in one of those strikes in Beirut. Even without him, Hezbollah kept up its return fire. Israel said around 100 Hezbollah rockets were launched towards northern Israel today. The number of Lebanese dead from the two-day Israeli offensive rose above 560. No wonder then that there is a huge exodus from the south and east of Lebanon. 700 British troops are understood to be heading to Cyprus to help, if necessary, in the evacuation of the more than 10,000 Britons who are thought to be in Lebanon.
They're leaving the south in any way they can. A sorry stream of those with no real idea what they're going towards, but full knowledge of what they are leaving. All ages, getting out. Desperate their lives won't end in the rubble of their homes like so many others. Thousands are now displaced by the bombardment. This man told me he had to leave other family members behind and take his children. He's no idea where he'll go from here. Yet for some, there remains a belief in Hezbollah and its leader. God protect Hezbollah and protect their young fighters, those martyrs. May God bless Hassan Nasrallah, she says. Behind them, the Israeli bombing of their towns and villages goes on for a second day. Israel says this operation is to destroy Hezbollah positions close to the border.
This is one of the roads through South Lebanon. It's completely empty in one direction, whereas on the other side, it's full of people and ambulances trying to get out.
And those ambulances are constantly travelling backwards and forwards to collect casualties beneath Israeli jets on their missions.
Israel says this bombardment will continue until the situation is safe enough for their people in the north to return. Hezbollah says that they will continue their attacks until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. And there you go, another ambulance heading down to the south. Neither the ceasefire nor the security that Israel seeks seems particularly likely at this point.
It's not just Hezbollah positions in the south and east being targeted, but commanders in the north. This strike on an apartment building in Beirut said to have killed the commander of Hezbollah's missile division. 6 others, including civilians, died in the same hit. The damage done to Hezbollah in the past days is greater than anything in their history. But their capacity to hit back remains. This an attack on Safed in northern Israel. Other strikes targeted deeper into the country in Haifa, where people took cover in shelters during the attack, and Kiryat Shimona near the border. Both sides know they have more left in the arsenal. Both seek to use it to maximum effect. Tonight, the funerals were underway for some of the more than 500 killed in Lebanon. People who will now be remembered as part of one of the darkest days in this country's history. Emma Murphy, News at 10, Southern Lebanon.
World leaders meeting at the United Nations in New York are desperate that the fighting in the Middle East does not escalate even further. President Biden, at his final UN meeting, said full-scale war is not in anyone's interest and it isn't too late for a ceasefire in Gaza to end the conflict. The head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, called the situation a non-stop nightmare that threatens to take the entire region with it.
The UN describes the General Assembly as the Super Bowl of international diplomacy. Today, amid the tightest security, global heads of state gathered knowing the stakes have just been raised again in Lebanon.
There are over 130 world leaders here, including President Biden, but there is only one subject which will dominate the crisis in the Middle East and how to prevent it spiralling into a regional war.
This was his last address to the UN, but even ahead of his swan song, there was no escaping the election from which he withdrew.
His Excellency Joseph R. Biden Jr.
His message was clear on the growing violence in the Middle East.
Full-scale war is not in anyone's interest. Even as the situation has escalated, a diplomatic solution is still possible. In fact, it remains the only path to lasting security to allow the residents from both countries to return to their homes and the border safely.
A message reiterated by the British Foreign Secretary on CNN.
This is not the time for a regional escalation. And of course, we all recognise that rockets have been flying from Hezbollah into Israel since October the 7th. There is tremendous capability in Lebanon. And so for all of those reasons, the way forward must be a political settlement.
But it was from Arab leaders that the most pointed criticism came.
I cannot recall a time of greater peril than this. The UN is under attack, literally and figuratively. For nearly a year, the sky blue flag flying over UN shelters and schools in Gaza has been powerless to protect innocent civilians from Israeli military bombardment.
But tonight, Iran's role in both Gaza and Lebanon will be highlighted when its new president speaks. Amid protests against Masoud Pezeshkian, he will address the General Assembly, his every word closely scrutinised for clues about how far Iran is willing to push its proxies into further escalation with Israel. Dan Rivers, News at 10, New York.
Israel's ambassador to the United Nations said his country still prefers a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Lebanon. We are not eager to start a ground invasion, he said. Well, today there was no let-up on the attacks on Lebanon. Satellite data from NASA recording fires shows the intensity of the strikes carried out by the Israeli military. The question, though, is where this goes next. We could see a continuation of Israeli airstrikes targeting Hezbollah, but whether it would degrade their ability to hit Israel enough is unclear. That could require a ground invasion, but history tells us that doesn't end well. More than 4 decades ago, Israel invaded Lebanon, pushing all the way to the edge of Beirut. It wasn't until 2000 when the country finally withdrew without reducing the threat that it faced. Then in 2006, a cross-border attack by Hezbollah sparked a month-long war that ended in a bloody stalemate with more than 1,000 people in Lebanon dead, including 158 Israelis, most of whom were soldiers. Now, let's go back to Emma in Beirut and John in Tel Aviv. John, maybe you first. You've been very clear over the course of the last week in our discussions about what Israeli strategy is, and also you've talked repeatedly about that history and how it weighs heavily on the Israelis. It does look as if they have, they've hit a lot of Hezbollah personnel and perhaps some of their weapons. Do you think it's enough? What do you think the calculation amongst the Israeli high command is tonight?
Good evening, Tom. Well, let's be absolutely clear. The Israelis have just inflicted on Hezbollah the worst week that the militia has ever experienced since its creation way back in 1982. And I think the Israelis are going to keep up the pressure, secure in the knowledge that should Hezbollah ever choose to retaliate in a really big way, and I think up to now they've shown some restraint, but should they ever retaliate in a really big way, the Americans will enter the war on Israel's side, something Hezbollah does not want to see happen. Tom, it was this time last week that the Israeli government made clear it was switching its focus from Gaza to South Lebanon and prioritizing the return of residents to their homes near the Lebanese border. Over the last 48 hours, we've seen a sort of symmetry as tens of thousands more Lebanese have been forced to flee their homes and migrate north, mainly to the Beirut area, where presumably they'll become a headache for the authorities and Hezbollah as they clamour to return to their homes. I think the Israelis will keep up the airstrikes for the time being in the hope that Hezbollah relents and announces a ceasefire, but Israel is giving a very good impression of being prepared to mount a ground invasion if it comes to it. But, as we've said before, history does not bode well for that.
John, thank you very much. Well, Emma, in the light of everything John's just said there, Hezbollah clearly haven't had an easy week. They've been pummeled. Many of their people have been injured or killed. Where do you think their calculation is tonight?
Well, you're quite right when you say they haven't had a good week. It's been absolutely dreadful and probably the worst in their history. If we just think through what's gone on in the space of 7 days, there have been the attacks on their communication systems, the assassination of their commanders, their command and control whole operation has been thrown into chaos, and then there have been the hits over the past couple of days on their weapons storage and their weapons launch positions. So it is an incredibly difficult situation for them now. The Americans say that they believe that Hezbollah has been knocked back about 20 years in terms of their capacity. But I think that is a slightly optimistic view from the Americans, because let's not forget that Hezbollah is the most armed paramilitary group in the world. They have an awful lot of manpower, they have an awful lot of weaponry, and they have a significant amount of support from different points on that axis of resistance that we've heard so much about over the past months. I think that, yes, they will have lost a lot of their weaponry, but they still haven't deployed their very long range and their most dangerous weapons. Obviously, they will be stored in places that are far more secure than some of their cheaper, shorter range missiles. And I think the concern shared both in Israel, around the world, and also in Lebanon is what happens if they choose to deploy them and what the consequences of that would be.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. Well, back here, the government's Cobra committee met today to discuss the situation in Lebanon and a potential need for a military evacuation of Britons there. And Shihab is here to talk about all this. Look, a lot of people listening to this programme, won't really have got to that, and we haven't talked about this in a kind of detailed way before. What would it look like if it happened?
Yeah, well, there are, we understand, more than 10,000 British nationals in Lebanon. There are other Western citizens who are also there. This would potentially be a coordinated effort. Anyone who I've spoken to in the defence area say that it would be Western allies working together. What we know, as you already mentioned, is that hundreds of troops have been sent to Cyprus. They are on standby to help with a military evacuation should it be required. We understand that the work for an evacuation has been going on for quite some time, whether that's done by air, and we know that the government would always prefer to use air, but if the airport is under attack and if it is not suitable to do so, we're told that plans are in place to use the sea if it is necessary. The Navy already has 2 ships in the Eastern Mediterranean anyway. But there's a lot of work that's going on. There was a Cobra meeting that took place today. The Defence Secretary came back from the Labour Party conference early to make sure that he could be at that meeting. He missed the Prime Minister speaking. He came out of that Cobra meeting and said the advice has not changed, that you should not travel to Lebanon, and if you're in Lebanon, you should get out as quickly as possible. They are monitoring this very, very closely.